Hello, and now the conclusion of Chapter 2. For the third time in as many nights, Will entered the same dream world. This time he awoke in the familiar town square, standing near the small cluster of trees in the southwest corner. Overjoyed, he quickly scanned the area. The scene appeared to drift in and out of focus, sometimes rippling, as if he were viewing his surroundings through a transparent liquid with a slight current flowing through it. But it was all there, just as he remembered it. The row of buildings with the colored doors to the north, the gate through which he'd entered the plaza in his first dream, and the large main gateway on the southern wall. There, in the center, was the fountain, standing out clearly against the hazy background. Will smiled, listening to the melody of its watery song. It was special. He'd always felt it. Why, however, he hadn't a clue. Today, there were fewer people in the plaza, but like the citizens he'd passed in the streets the night before, their looks were more direct, and their smiles seemed more heartfelt. A group conversing at the far end of the square turned and faced him. One of them waved as if they were old friends. Will grinned and returned the greeting. Do they remember me? He wondered. He decided to sit for a moment to soak in the experience and allow the scene to stabilize. As he turned and walked to the nearby bench, he was surprised to see that it was now wooden, not stone, as it was when he'd sat there 2 nights ago. He then noticed red tulips growing at the base of one of the trees. They were not here before, but they were a welcome addition. Will also liked the wooden bench. It was somewhat worn and weathered, and looked more comfortable than its stone counterpart. He stepped beneath the trees and took a seat. It was cool in the shade, and a gentle breeze blew through the plaza today, stirring the leaves in the branches overhead. A perfect morning, he thought, looking out over the plaza. Will's plan for the day was to explore the town. His time here was precious, and he wanted to spend it wisely. So where should I begin? He asked himself. As he studied his surroundings more carefully, he realized that a few things had changed since he was here last. Relatively small changes, but still. For instance, there were only 5 doors set in the northern wall, whereas before there'd been 6. And some of them were a different color. One was painted a dark, rich burgundy, which he would have remembered, for he loved the color. In addition, there were now multi-paned windows next to 2 of the doors. To the east, the vines that covered the wall were studded with small blue flowers. And turning to his right, Will saw that the entire southern wall was now topped with the notched crenellation so characteristic of medieval castles. The analytical side of Will's mind stepped to the fore and began asking questions. What had caused things to change? Since this was his dream, obviously he was responsible. But how did he do it? Were the changes the result of fleeting conscious thoughts or subconscious intentions? Perhaps they were nothing more than random fluctuations, merely hiccups in his sleeping brain. After all, he was dreaming, and dreams did tend to transform suddenly, often in bizarre and illogical ways. Will quickly put a stop to this train of thought, for now was not the time to dwell on these technical issues. He would have plenty of time to speculate when he returned to the waking world. Curious what lay behind the colored doors, he stood up and started to walk toward them. But then he stopped. One of the doors was now different from the other, rounded on the top rather than rectangular. This had happened in the last few minutes, not while he was gone overnight. Interesting, he thought. Had anything else changed? He stood still for a moment, taking careful note of the dreamscape in front of him. The scene was still somewhat blurry, but as he looked more closely at particular objects, they came into focus. The green door was somewhat weathered and rough in texture, while another, a dark royal blue, looked as if someone had recently given it a fresh coat of paint. The hinges and latches of all the doors were black cast iron, clearly hammered by hand. Both windows on the ground floor had 6 panes of glass, 3 over 3, and the glass itself had small bubbles and wavy distortions. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. Will found that the longer he looked at things, giving them his full attention, the more details he could see. Details he shouldn't be able to make out from this far away. Was his eyesight improving? Or were the objects themselves changing in structure? But this is just a dream, he reminded himself. Such questions were pointless to ask. There weren't really things out there. And at this moment, he was lying in a dark bedroom with his eyes shut. So he wasn't really seeing any of this. It was all imaginary. Will had been focusing on individual features, but broadening his gaze to take in the entire picture, he found that the scene now had a different appearance, not only more sharply defined, but brighter and more colorful. It was also vividly three-dimensional, unnaturally so. He then turned and looked at the southern wall. It was dull by comparison, and a small change had occurred, for there was now a lone tree growing in the southeast corner. I always thought that corner was a little bare, he muttered to himself. After performing the same stabilizing technique on this end of the square, he checked the northern side again. It remained bright and clear. Good, he thought. Focusing his attention on things seemed to steady them. For how long, though? Then, Will noticed 2 young men emerge from the green door, the 4th from left to right. They were laughing and seemed a bit tipsy. Probably a tavern, he thought, smiling. It seemed like a good place to start, so he headed across the plaza to investigate the establishment, which, according to the sign hanging above the door, was called the Heart's Glen. A good name for a pub, he remarked to himself. Reaching the entrance, Will cautiously opened the door and peered inside. It was dark and cozy, but larger than he expected. In fact, based on the size of the building seen from outside, it couldn't possibly be this spacious. Against the back wall was a large stone fireplace with a crackling fire that cast a mellow glow throughout the room. Scattered throughout the space were a number of small wooden tables, some round, some square, with 3 or 4 chairs clustered around each of them. There were perhaps a dozen people in the room, mostly men, sitting in groups of 2 or 3, drinking and talking in low tones. As he stepped inside, a few of them looked his way and raised their glasses or mumbled generic greetings. Will smiled and nodded in return, then closed the door behind him. Immediately to his right stood a long, sturdy wooden counter where 2 men sat on stools, drinking from stoneware mugs. Past this, at the far side of the room, several long tables and simple plank benches were lined up end to end. Along the wall on his left, rectangular tables and high-backed benches formed a row of booths, interrupted by a small door. A young woman, sitting at one of the tables near the hearth, stood up and stared at him for a moment. A smile slowly spread across her lips. She was dressed plainly, a long brown skirt and a loose-fitting white blouse with a low neckline and full sleeves gathered just above the elbow. The short white apron tied around her waist indicated to Will that she worked here. "I'll be right with you, dear," she said cheerfully. The woman turned back to the seated patrons, said a few words, then picked up a tankard from the table and made her way across the room. Will took a seat on the stool closest to him and watched her walk to the far end of the bar. She placed the empty mug on the counter, then turned and slowly sauntered toward him, gently swinging her hips with each step in a distinctly feminine way. As she approached, Will stood and faced her. She was a beautiful woman, dark eyes, full red lips, and a fair complexion. Her lustrous black hair hung in loose curls that tumbled well past her shoulders. And though he felt certain he'd never seen her before, neither here nor in the waking world, for he would have remembered such a woman, there was something hauntingly familiar in her eyes. She came quite close and looked up at him through her long lashes. "And what can I get for my handsome young man today?" she asked, taking both his hands. Had they met before? Or was she this friendly and forward with all of her customers? The woman placed Will's hands on her hips and held them there for a moment. Then, putting her hands on his shoulders, she stared into his eyes. "Perhaps a kiss," she said, with an alluring smile. Will blushed. He didn't know this woman, and the room was full of strangers. Feeling awkward and self-conscious, he instinctively tensed up. But then he remembered this was merely a dream, his private reality. There was no reason to shrink from her advances. This was a moment to be enjoyed. "Yes," he said to her. She slid her hands behind his neck and gently pulled his face close to hers. He could feel her warm breath on his lips. She closed her eyes and kissed him, first softly, then more deeply, then, wrapping her arms around his waist, She laid her head on his shoulder and pressed her chest tightly against his. "Oh, Will," she said with a sigh, "it's so good to see you." Apparently, she knew him. He wondered if she had a name, but since she was his creation, wouldn't he have to give her one? "Lily," she uttered, as if reading his mind. "And yes, my sweet, we have met before." She sighed again, then released him and took a step back. "You need to go now, don't you?" she said with pouting lips. "I don't think so," he replied, taken off guard. "Not yet, anyway." Lily smiled. "It's okay," she told him. "I'll be here, and you'll be back." She took him by the arm and started leading him to the door. Will was confused. Why did she think he had to leave? The room around him then began to disintegrate. He clutched her arm and tried to hold on, but she gently freed herself from his grasp. "Good night, Will," she whispered as the light dimmed. "I'll be missing you." And thank you for joining me this afternoon. We will return shortly with Chapter 3.